Hello everybody, today on JayEmm Friends, another video talking about bikes. I want to say a huge thank you to all of you that tuned into my video talking about helmets. The response was amazing. Not only did far more people than I ever imagined watch it, but it was very clear to me from the comment section that you'd love to see more two-wheeled content. So we're going to be doing a little series on this channel, not the other one, because that's called JayEmm on Cars, where I'm going to be talking about my journey getting back into bikes. I want to do this for a couple of reasons. First off, it's very clear that you're interested in what it is that I have to say and the journey that I'm finding myself on. Secondly, I'm pretty sure there are a whole bunch of people out there in a similar situation to myself. Those who've been into bikes but years ago, have been out of the saddle for a while, and are now kind of dipping your toes back into the water. I hope some of this content will also be interesting to those who've simply never been on a bike and are wondering whether it's the right thing for them or not. So please hit the comment section, give me all your ideas for the kind of things you'd like to see me talking about. Today I'm going to be recording two videos. Initially it was going to be one sort of big massive one getting you all up to date, but I figured, you know what, it's actually two very separate topics. In this I'm going to be talking about all the things I've noticed that have changed in the biking world over the last 10 years since I really rode on a sort of frequent basis, and in the second video I'm going to be telling you some stories about my journey to try and buy my first new bike since I was a teenager. I already own one motorbike, my grandfather's old Triton, which really was the spark that lit this fire in me once again. However, that's a precious family heirloom, and it's a bike essentially from the 1950s and 60s. It's not really the easiest thing to ride or to maintain or anything else, and if something happened to it, I would be absolutely mortified. So I've decided that I'd like something a lot more modern and easy to go alongside it, and well, I'm at that sort of fun stage where I'm trying to work out what that is. I've had to go on a bunch of stuff. Some of it went well, some of it went very, very not well. And yeah, part two is going to be talking about that, because hopefully there'll also be some interesting information in there, again, for people thinking about buying themselves a new bike. Okay then, on to today and what's changed in the biking world. Well, as far as I can see it, there's sort of 3 or 4 big things. We'll start off with engines, because let's be honest here, a bike is essentially an engine with some wheels strapped to it. Now, although it's only really been about 5 or 6 years since I rode, as far as I'm concerned, it feels more like a full 10, because most of the bikes that I did ride when I was younger were quite old, a lot of 1970s two-strokes, and the stuff I did ride that was sort of new was then already a few years old. In other words, I never really rode anything newer than probably about a 2011, 2012. The last thing I rode really with any regularity was an Aprilia Shiver, which was relatively new at the time, and I quite liked it, although apparently not many other people did. Anyway, back then, a full-blooded, you know, sort of proper 1000cc sports bike was making, you know, about 180, 190 horsepower. They're getting to 200 or thereabouts. Now, there are bikes out there that if you fit them with the right kit and do the map, they'll make 230, 240 horsepower. That's crazy. There are naked bikes out there now making over 200 horses. That's a ludicrous amount of go. This is just obscene. As far as I'm concerned, some of these bikes are making what I consider to be MotoGP levels of power. This is nuts. And this is something I'm going to talk about a lot in part 2, because this has been a bit of a concern for me. You know, I mostly rode bikes with like under 100 horsepower, and now I'm looking at stuff that's got double. I am kind of worried if it's going to be too much. But that's one thing that's changed. They've also had to change because of emissions. Bikes are now, I think, from 2020 onwards on what they call Euro 5, which confusingly is roughly equivalent to a car's Euro 6. And this has had a few impacts. First off, of course, they've had to get a lot cleaner. They've got an emissions sort of, you know, lower and all that sort of stuff. But it's also had an effect on the exhausts. And that's upsetting. You see, as far as I'm concerned, bike exhausts now are just not sexy. They've been going this way for quite some time, but if you look at a bike from, say, 20 years ago, exhausts were much cooler, far more compact. They put them in more interesting places. I mean, the iconic bikes to me are stuff like, you know, the Ducatis of that era. To many people I know, the 916 is like the ultimate bike. Me, I'm more sort of 999. You get those nice under-seat pipes. The MV Agusta F4, those iconic sort of four tails at the back. But now, seeing a bike with an under-seat exhaust, I mean, I can't think I've actually bumped into one in my sort of search, not a new one. They're all sort of side or low exit, and the exhaust has become so big and bulky, it's frustrating. In fact, one of the issues I've had in my search for a bike is I'd like one that sounds decent, but apparently my only choice now for an exhaust is either a sort of full, super restrictive, you can sort of nearly not even hear it type thing, or a totally decatted, nutty sports exhaust that's too loud even to get you on a track day. And I don't want either of those things. But I think I found a potential solution anyway. But yeah, that's one thing that has definitely changed, and I think not for the better. What has changed though, I think, and is a real benefit to people like myself, and one of the reasons I'm looking now for a new motorbike, is rider aids. Any and every review of a bike that I see, and actually I should take a minute to mention some of the bike channels that I've been watching. So in no particular order, the big ones are the likes of 44 Teeth, Motorcycle News. I think my possible favorite is Bike World. Really like the presenter on there, Chris, I think it is, though don't quote me on that. Really like the Bike World channel. Also should give a shout out to the Missenden Flyer, Tim Rodey Rides, Lamb Chop Rides, and I'm sure I've missed out a whole bunch of stuff, but there's some really good content, and I don't envy those guys, because, you know, filming cars is difficult enough, but mounting a camera on a car is not that bad. Doing it on a bike, and talking, and riding, and everything else, like, that's a skill. That's a real skill. So it's been really nice to sort of, you know, get into the sort of bike YouTube scene, and there's some really great content out there. So yeah, if you haven't watched any of those channels, please, and if you've got suggestions of channels to watch, hit the comment section again, tell me what it is that I should be looking at. But one of the big things, you watch any of these videos, they'll all talk about electronics. Now, when I was last riding, ABS was certainly a thing. ABS existed, but ABS wasn't fitted to many bikes that I rode. In fact, I think I maybe only ever rode one bike that had it. I mean, it's been around for donkey's years. I think BMWs or whatever had it in the 80s or 90s. But as a sort of regular thing, 10 years ago, you just didn't see it. It was an option if it was there, and most of the bikes I rode, it wasn't an option. However, now, not just ABS is standard, but you've also got a suite of electronics that, again, 10 years ago would have been considered MotoGP stuff. So bikes now have what's called an IMU, an inertia measurement unit, or a lot of them do anyway. So not only do you have your ABS, you've got cornering ABS, which is intelligent. So it knows how much you've got the bike lent over and will adjust the sort of ABS effect to suit. So it doesn't just stand you upright, which of course would cause a very big problem in of itself. You've also got not just traction control, but adjustable traction control. You've got anti-wheelie. You've got all sorts of stuff. Bikes now even have cruise control too. I mean, cruise control on a bike, that's terrifying. And we're not talking about like Honda Goldwings, big Harleys, because they had, you know, cassette players and stuff back in the day. They had reverse gears, all that sort of stuff. I'm not talking about these kind of bikes. I'm talking about your sort of middle of the road, regular, you know, naked sort of sports bike type stuff. You know, nothing remarkable. These are not just top flight machines that are 50, 60 grand or whatever. Although I think the Ducati Superleggera is like 95,000 quid. And I thought the Desmo Zadici was expensive. But anyway, so rider aids are pretty much the reason I've decided I kind of want a new bike, because although I'm reasonably confident, I'm also very wary of the fact that it has been a long time, and I'm looking at bikes that are a lot more powerful than they were. So having those, and having those as standard with pretty much everything, that's kind of nice. You've also got other stuff that's not just safety orientated, but performance as well. So a lot of bikes have a quick shifter too. If you're not familiar, that basically means you can change gear without the clutch, both up and down. Again, track bikes had those years ago. Now, loads of stuff has it. I even rode a bike the other day that has active aerodynamics on it. This is bonkers kind of stuff. So I think it's actually really good that bikes have gained these sorts of things. I think this is really nice. And for the vast majority of them, if you think you're that hot on a bike, you can generally sort of turn them off or turn them mostly off anyway. And certainly for me, I'm very happy for them to be there. I don't feel that they're intrusive. I haven't ridden a single bike yet and gone, ugh, this has been ruined by the rider aids. Like, quite the opposite. It's given me a lot more confidence to enjoy the bike, and as far as I'm concerned, that's only ever going to be a good thing. But the biggest difference for me is that the entire motorcycling landscape appears to have changed. Your path both into bikes and then through bikes is unlike it was 15 or 16 years ago. So for some context, when I got my license back in 2006, it was a fairly simple process. First off, you got your CBT, which still exists today. That's your compulsory basic training. Essentially, it's a day in a car park, then out on the road with an instructor, at the end of which they say, yes, you're safe to ride, or no, you're not. This then lasts 2 years and gives you your basic access to a simple up to 125cc motorbike if you're 17, or a moped if you're 16. You can't carry a pillion, you have to have L plates, and the idea is that's your sort of first step into the motorbiking world. And once you'd got your license, your L plates came off, you could carry a pillion, and you could ride anything of unlimited size up to 33 horsepower for the first 2 years. After that probationary period had elapsed, you were automatically qualified to ride anything you like. But now it's completely different. As before, you start off with your CBT, which I believe is relatively unchanged, and the same goes for the theory test. However, the practical has now been split into 2 parts, and I recall when this happened because it created quite a bit of controversy. First off, they don't make car drivers do their test in 2 parts. And secondly, to do part 1, you have to have a big space. And there weren't many places in the country that had enough room, which meant that if you happened to live somewhere quite remote, you had to go a heck of a long way to do your test. And there were also complaints that certain elements of the test simply couldn't be done on certain types of motorbikes. In other words, a ZX6R is just not as manoeuvrable as a Vespa, and the test really was geared towards smaller, more nimble motorbikes. And that really did seem a little bit harsh. Once you've done that, then they recommend about 10 days later, provided you've passed Module 1, you then do Module 2, which again is, I think, like the old practical test. In other words, you're out with someone following with a radio comms telling you what to do. And like before, after you've completed that test, you are technically a fully certified motorbike rider, but for what they call the A1 category, which has quite a few restrictions. Then, after 2 years, unlike before, where you got automatically upgraded, you now have to do your Module 1 and 2 again, but on a slightly more powerful bike. Get that, and you're now an A2 rider, which then lets you ride a slightly bigger bike, up to 47 horsepower, which is decent on a motorbike. But if you do want to ride a full fat bike, you then have to take another test 2 more years later, which again involves another Module 1 and 2. In other words, whereas I was allowed to ride a full power bike at 19 years old, having done a CBT theory and practical, today you have to be at least 21 and you'll have done a CBT theory and 3 sets of 2-part practicals. That's a lot of hoops to jump through. And it's this new process which I think is so responsible for bikes now being so different to what they were. You see, when I learned to ride, the idea was you started off on your 125cc learner legal bike, then in your sort of 2-year probationary period, you'd buy something like a CB500F or whatever, have it restricted down to your 33 horsepower, then when your time was up, you'd have it de-restricted, then you'd buy a CBR600, then eventually a Fireblade. Well, there's a couple of problems. First off, the rules for A2 dictate that a bike cannot be restricted to less than half its original power. In other words, if a manufacturer wants to sell an A2 compatible bike, it can't have started with more than about 94 horsepower. And this has created a bit of an issue. In other words, all of your bikes that sort of used to be just over 100 horsepower or so, they've now kind of limited them so that they can sell an A2 compatible version. And evidently, A2 is big business. Go on any manufacturer's website and you'll see a whole section dedicated to A2 bikes. When I was learning, this didn't really exist because you could restrict essentially anything. Now, not the case. And I gather there are probably a lot of people out there for whom the A2 license is enough. It's all they ever need. And so there's no requirement for them to go onto a big full fat bike. And what appears to be happening here is that the market really is sort of splitting itself in 2. With the stuff at the top, the hardcore liter sports bikes, you know, the race replicas, they've become ever more extreme and expensive. Once upon a time, I mean, maybe my information was always out of date anyway, I don't know, I figured that a nice proper superbike was sort of 15 grand. Now, 25 to 30 seems to be your point of entry for many manufacturers' litre superbikes. But on the other hand, this sort of middle ground, your ZX6R, your CBR 600s, I mean, I went on Honda's website this morning. There's no CBR 600. That to me was a genre-defining bike. Instead, what you have now is the CB650 or CBR 650, which is designed to be a learner-compatible bike, or, you know, meets the A2 rules. You can halve the power and you can ride it as an A2. There's nothing. There's nothing there. It's nuts. Go on Kawasaki's websites and the ZX6R is sort of buried in a dark corner. They either want to put you on a big litre bike or something a lot more sort of learner-friendly. The other thing that has happened, and I think a lot of people consider this a good thing, is that 400s are back. Once upon a time, you could pick up a 400 for an absolute pittance, a bit like a 250, because for people like myself, you either had your L plates and you were stuck with a 125, or once you had your license, you wanted something a bit more proper. The likes of the Aprilia RS250 was great if you were still stuck to 33 horsepower, but that was never going to be for very long, so there wasn't really much point staying with it. As soon as you could ride something a bit bigger and faster, you did. Now though, once you've got either your A1 or your A2, unless you actually actively take that step forwards, you're going to be stuck with that license forever. So there's a lot more incentive for people to buy bikes that meet these kind of regs. And 400s kind of fit the brief nicely. And that counts for both old and new. Once upon a time, they were the bargain of the century because they were too big for a learner and too slow for someone with a full license. Now though, they kind of hit that sweet spot. I should point out that if you are a little bit older, 25 or over, you can still do your direct access. In other words, take your test on a bigger bike and you can skip all of this nonsense. But I do fear for the biking world because it's been made really, really difficult to get into for a young person. And the fact is, if people don't get into it when they're young and excited about it, the chances are they're likely not really to get into it when they're older and they've got a little bit of money because they'll have probably bought a car. So it is a bit of a tricky one. In other news, it does appear like the sports bike is rapidly falling out of favour, and instead what people are now buying is the naked bike. Triumph no longer make a Daytona. They have the Street Triple and the Speed Triple. Your Japanese manufacturers, they're all going in heavily on the naked bike thing. And this suits me just fine because naked bikes are what I like. They give you that kind of thrill. They remind you of how fast you're going and they are a lot more comfortable and easy to ride. I'm very, very happy about this. And I should certainly point out, it is far, far from all doom and gloom because over the last year, I've been really reminded of why it is that I love bikes so much. And the simple answer is, it's the people. From the likes of Simon, who restored Grandad's bike, to all of the people I've spoken to in dealerships, both the guys serving and the people there, customers, they've been amazing. They've been absolutely wonderful. I've met quite a few channel fans, I've made some new friends, and the fact is, though I know from the outside looking in, bikers can sometimes appear, shall we say, a little coarse, a little uncouth, but the fact is, they're the nicest, most lovable, warm, welcoming people. I've had a few incidents on bikes where I've broken down, been stuck on the side of the road, and a biker will always stop and help another biker. You just don't get that with cars. Cars can be really super tribal, and I'm not saying that bikes can't be and won't be, but the fact is, if you're a biker, you're part of that group. The one thing I just love about being out on a bike, the nod. You know, you're passing another bike, you give them the nod, and it makes you feel like a part of a big family, because you are. And that's something that is missing from a lot of the car thing, and I love that it's still present and correct in bikes. There's a lot that just hasn't changed, and I'm so glad that that is one of those things, because it's made me feel really, really good about getting back into bikes. And honestly, I am so excited about getting back out there on two wheels. And even my other half, who, when I said to her I was going to get back into biking, she was very, very much against the idea. And my family have obviously been quite nervous because, you know, Grandad died in a bike accident. So this is something that weighs on my mind all the time. They've actually kind of gotten a bit into it. Well, my mum hasn't really, but my other half has. And now she's been to a few bike places. She's spoken to different people. You know, we're going to go to the Motocross GP at the end of next month. And she's really, really excited about that. and she's gotten into it, and she now understands a little bit about what the biking world is. And I don't think she's going to be out and getting her license anytime soon, but I'm glad that she's at least been able to see what it is that I see in it, and I'm sure most of you watching probably feel the same way. So I'd love to hear from you, your stories about how you got into biking. Was it a family member? Like, have you not got your license yet? Are you thinking about doing it? Are you one of these people I was talking about that have got an A2 license and you're kind of going to stay there? I'd really love to know, because your feedback will help inform the content that I create on this channel, because I'd love to know more about you, my audience. So yeah, there we go. That's part 1. Please join me for part 2, which will be released very shortly, probably tomorrow. So by the time you watch this, hopefully, it might already be out. Anyway, thanks for sticking with it, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.